Well, thank you very much to everyone. Thanks for your attention and to all the welcome speakers and the keynotes. Good afternoon again from Jakarta to all of you joining us today, Your Excellencies, representatives of governments, experts, ladies and gentlemen, and to all of you following us today online around the world. And welcome to this session. As Dee already introduced myself, I'm Beatriz Fernandez. I work with UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. And let me just give a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists today. We have Ms. Henriette Fagerman, the first Counselor for Environment, Climate Action and Digital of the Delegation of the European Union of ASEAN. We also have Mr. Alex Lau, the Team Leader for Environment and Sustainable Commodities of the British Embassy in Jakarta. Thank you. Mr. Agus Purnomo, Senior Advisor of Golden Agri Resources, and I'm sure a lot of you already know him. And we have two more panelists online that you will see on the screens to your left or right. We have joining us Ms. Corazon Che de Jesus. She's the Director of the Sustainable Use and Access and Benefit Sharing Division of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. And Mr. Abu Meridian, the campaign's leader of Kaum Telapak. And very welcome to both of you online. I'll be very brief and thank again to our wonderful partners, UNCTAD that is here today. We also thank the Center for International Forest Research and World Agroforestry, IPB University, the University and Center for Climate and Sustainable Finance of the University of Indonesia for the wonderful collaboration for making this consultation possible, and certainly to UNEP WCMC and to the Trade Hub Project for the support. And the panel today, we're aiming to discuss and exchange insights, perspective, and actions that we'll hear from the expert today, from governments, from private sector, from civil society, to understand what are the challenges, what are the priorities, but also what are the opportunities in Asia to promote sustainable agriculture and supply chain, to protect nature, to safeguard the environment, but also facilitate a sustainable social and economic development. And in all of this, what is the role of trade to catalyze action for it? As we have already heard from previous interventions, this is a very timely discussion because we are facing a triple planetary crisis on nature loss, on climate change and pollution, the three of them interconnected, but we're also seeing unsustainable patterns of consumption and production, and we have also seen that there is a global pattern of trade that has been disrupted and is causing the rising food and energy crisis. As we know, agriculture is a significant sector that contributes to this region, and equally this region is a significant contributor to the global output in the world, with smallholders at the core of this sector. And let me just start briefly by putting the context of why we're talking about in all this mix about trade. Why are we trying to find the synergies between environment, biodiversity, and trade? And just to re-mention that over 50% of the global domestic product depends on nature. And international trade is plays a key role for development and growth. Actually, according to estimates from UNCTAD, the global trade reached a record of $32 trillion in 2022. So while there's increasing evidence that trade can actually have negative impacts on people, on nature, there are also opportunities for trade to become a positive actor for change. So in today's session, we're trying to understand and discuss how do we build a mutually supportive vision between trade, between biodiversity, and between social and economic development There are many good news that we have heard this afternoon at the start of this consultation, from the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, from free trade agreements, from all the work that ASEAN countries are doing and the region is also doing. So let's have a conversation now. Just before we start, a few short housekeeping points. I'm going to start asking each of our panelists in person and online for their intervention. Then we're going to have the opportunity to exchange with all of you for questions and answers. And I also invite the people who are following us online to put your questions on the QA box. And at the end, we're going to have a final round with your last key comments, and we're going to close the session. So without further ado, let me introduce and invite Henriette Fagerman to give us your views on, first of all, you're going to give us a glimpse and an overview of what are the developments of the EU deforestation-free products regulation, and also to understand, in your view, what are the key enablers and actions to make a reality this vision between trade, biodiversity, and sustainable development. Please go ahead. To all of you, you can follow the presentation on the screens and also online. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to those who might be joining from elsewhere. Thank you very much for inviting me for this panel and giving me the opportunity to present the regulation on deforestation and forest degradation-free supply chains. I think many of you may have heard my presentation before. I've given it about 100 times already, but I will try to make it more exciting. So in case you have heard it before, watch out for the good news. So let's move directly into it. Next slide, please. I think I don't need to say so much about the context. It's there on the screen. There's a lot of forest loss that is still happening, has still been happening during the last 30-year period. A lot of this forest loss is legal, and these are the forest loss and deforestation are important drivers for climate change and loss of biodiversity. I think we've heard it already in the introductory remarks, and here you see some numbers that have been assembled on how this actually looked. Also, we've already heard that a big part of the deforestation is linked to expansion of agricultural land, and that this is linked in particular to a more limited series of commodities. And then the last point why the EU has decided to engage on this issue and regulate on this issue is that we in the European Union are major consumers of the commodities, some of the commodities that can be associated with deforestation and forest degradation. And our consumers are very clear. They do not want to consume products. They like the products, but they don't want to consume them if they can be seen or associated with deforestation or forest degradation. Next slide. So what the regulation is about, generally, to minimize the EU's contribution to deforestation and forest degradation worldwide, and thereby also reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss contribution. And we do this in two ways. First of all, by minimizing the risk that the products from supply chains that are responsible for forest degradation or deforestation can be put on the European market. But also, and I think this is very timely for today's conference, to make sure that we increase the European Union's demand for and trade in legal and deforestation-free commodities and products. Next slide, please. So, I think if you have followed this for a while, you probably know very well the scope: palm oil, soy, wood, cattle, cocoa, coffee, and rubber. Most of them relevant for the region, or definitely for the regions of people who might be listening online. So these were selected, I would say, based on a really thorough impact assessment. You may have noticed that at first there were only 6 commodities that was proposed by the European Commission. Rubber was added during the negotiations that led to the final regulation. But basically the impact assessment that was carried out showed that these were the most important commodities from 2 points of view. First of all, from contributing to deforestation, and secondly, matched with the EU's consumption of these. So this does not mean that these are the only commodities that contribute to deforestation anywhere in the world, but it means that it's the ones where the EU has a consumption that would kind of justify that we are working on this. there will be maybe an expansion of the scope over time if the situation changes, if more commodities will contribute to deforestation in a different way, or if the trade patterns change so that the EU will start importing, exporting more of other commodities. Next slide. So let me just quickly run through the principles, because we hear a lot in different fora, and there seems to be sometimes confusion on what it is that this regulation actually does. So first of all, there's no ban on any country or any commodities. So all the countries and all the commodities, that even the ones that you just saw on the screen, are still can still be sold on the European market. The only requirement is that the operator can demonstrate that the commodities are deforestation-free and legal. There's no discrimination, because this regulation applies both to the products that are produced in the EU and imported from outside. And then the last important principle is the cutoff date of 31st December 2020, so which means that products that are produced on land that are deforested after that date are not allowed on the European market, whereas if land was deforested, let's say in 2019, the products that are produced on that land are allowed on the European market. This is important because, first of all, I don't know what's wrong with this microphone. Am I holding it correctly? Let's try another one. Thank you. Let's see if this is better. So this cutoff date, as you're well aware, is in line with the SDG commitments of halting forest deforestation by this date that was agreed in the context of the SDGs and signed up to by the global community. So you can say that this is actually the EU putting into law what we have all agreed. And then also, very importantly, that there is no punishment for historical deforestation, but it's really an aim to try to look forward and prevent further deforestation and forest degradation. Next slide, please. So what the actual requirements of the regulation is, there is two main things. One of them is mandatory due diligence, which will be carried out by operators who place the products on the European market or export them from the EU. So it's the EU operators that have the responsibility under the regulation. And they have to prove that these products are deforestation-free and legal and traceable. And this they have to do by a due diligence statement. So it's, as you can see, a rather limited number of requirements that needs to be demonstrated. We often get questions about how certification schemes or other third-party systems can be useful for the deforestation regulation. And the reply is that they can be very useful because they are actually a very important source of information that the operators on the EU market can use when they carry out the due diligence. They cannot replace the due diligence statement, but they can definitely be used as a source of information for the operators. Next slide. So the other important part of the regulation is the country benchmarking, which will make sure that there is a risk assigned to countries or region according to the risk of deforestation. 3 different categories: standard, low, and high risk. The criteria are quite straightforward, linked to the rate of deforestation and agricultural land expansion. And this system is currently being developed by a technical support contract. So this will be ready a little bit later before the implementation of the regulation. For the moment, again, we hear a lot of stories sometimes about this or that country that will be high risk, low risk, standard risk. For the moment, everybody is at standard risk, and that's very important, and there are no changes that will happen unless there is a consultation with the countries that would be concerned by such a change. So what it actually means, not so much in terms of the actual workload, because the due diligence procedure will be largely the same. If you are standard or high risk, it will be the same amount of work that has to be done. If you're low risk, then it will be a little bit less work, because you will not have to carry out a risk assessment. The main difference is that there will be more controls for the higher risk, so 9% controls of shipments from high risk area, 3% for standard, and 1% from low risk. Next slide. Right now, we are preparing for the implementation, so we are really stepping up cooperation with both the government and private sector of all the countries where this will have an impact. And here, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia, as you may be aware, we have established a task force where we are looking into the specific issues that may be tricky or may be required to look at in the implementation of the regulation. So, for example, smallholder issues is of course very important, linked to how do we establish traceability and a number of other issues that are similar for other countries, but here with a focus on the commodities that are really relevant for these two countries. As I said, there will be a specific dialogue with countries that could be classified as high risk, and this we will know later on which they might be. We are in the process in the European Commission to develop guidelines for all the operators and traders that will help them to make sure they know how to implement this, and putting a number of support tools in place to make sure that it's as easy as possible. Next slide. So the implementation tasks, very briefly, we are in the process of developing an IT system that will make information very easily accessible from all the operators on the European market so that we avoid duplication of work. The benchmarking, as I mentioned, we are in the process of developing an implementing act that will be up and running by the entry into application, which is December 2024, the guidelines. And then we have already started preparing for review of whether other commodities or other parts of the regulation will need to be amended later on. So you can see a timeline here. And if you go to the next slide, you can see all of this in a more graphic way. So basically we are now in the period after entry into force and before entry into obligation. So we are in this 19 months time slot where we are really trying to find out how can we cooperate and how can we make sure that this implementation will be as smooth as possible. So I hope that this both gave an overview and replied to your first question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henriette. And as Harry said at the beginning, seems like all countries have the similar objective. And it's good to see that developments are also incentivizing cooperation among countries, and we see the opportunities as well to continue. And now I will turn to you, Alex. He's a team leader for environment and sustainable commodities of the British Embassy in Jakarta. We know the UK is doing a similar path on due diligence for its risk commodities. And there's definitely a lot of interest to also understand what is the UK government's vision about sustainable commodities. I know you have a presentation for us, so I invite you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you to the UN institutions in Indonesia and to CIFOR for extending the invitation today. What a fantastic and extremely varied audience, you know, across government, civil society, private sector, really great group. So thank you. So I mean, the UK and Indonesia have been working on in this sort of area for a really long time. So it extends. Oh, okay. So our kind of partnership on sustainable agricultural production extends literally decades. You know, to the 2000, 2001 Jakarta Bali conferences on FLEG, and even before. So we've been working on this stuff for a long time, and we recognize it's hard, and we recognize that the process continues, and this sort of engagement is really important, I think, for like moving that process forward. So I only have one slide. Sorry, I have so much less information than Henriette. It's really embarrassing, and that's basically because the UK hasn't actually laid its legislation that will do a kind of similar thing around deforestation. And so I'll set out a bit of the context and the things we're trying to achieve, and then try and explain a bit about the way that we're going to do it. So the kind of legislative approach. So I think where we really start is with national policy. We recognize that the only way to have systemic impact as you know a relatively small part of the market is to work with producer countries in ensuring that their national policies are really strong and well respected. So that's been a really core part of our partnership with Indonesia, Over the last sort of 25 years, we've helped to build CIFOR-ICRAF, the system which monitors and governs sustainable timber production in Indonesia, as well as now, given that we, the UK and Indonesia, have a trade agreement on this, helps to monitor the trade in sustainable timber between the UK and Indonesia. We've also been working very closely with the Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs on developing and strengthening the legislation that underpins ISPO, as well as trying to work out how best we can implement that across Indonesia. So trying to have a standard that is strong, sustainable, but also provides economic benefits, in particular for smallholders. So that's kind of on the national policy side. And then we see that, national policy sets a really firm foundation for action, but what's really important is implementation. And there, it is really tough. Obviously, the stronger your standard, the harder the implementation is. And so if you want to aim for a strong standard, and I think we all do, then you really need to work hard on implementation. And one of the best ways to get implementation going is to introduce really strong incentives. We can provide as much development assistance as we can, but ultimately what will work is the market responding. And so we've been really trying to focus on this. As I mentioned, we now have a trade agreement with the EU on sustainable timber, and so we think that provides better market incentives because UK producers will more easily access Indonesian sustainable timber. We're now trying to explore how we can broaden that out. So how can we take lots of different countries, all of whom import timber, and try to get them to engage with the Indonesian sustainable timber standard in a way that will keep on strengthening those market incentives for complying with that timber standard in Indonesia. And then you look at something like ISPO, palm oil. Let's be realistic. The implementation of this with smallholders in particular is very low. How can we move towards better implementation, particularly in smallholders, but also in large businesses? And we've spoken to many large palm oil producers, and a lot of them will have some of their mills certified ISPO, and some of the mills still not. So what is the direction forward for that? So the UK sees a path here in terms of our legislative approach in providing better market incentives for national policy. And so we introduced in 2021 some legislation which we called the Environment Act. And so the Environment Act explained that we would be bringing forth secondary legislation, so more technical legislation, around UK forest risk commodities regulations. And basically what that will do is introduce a due diligence obligation on particular large firms who are importing large quantities of a particular set of commodities to ensure that those commodities were grown on land that was legally occupied and legally used. So legal land use, legal land ownership, or land tenure. And what we think is really helpful about that is basically what we're asking companies to do is ensure that their production is legal in the country of origin. And so this creates a really strong market signal for those, all those national systems that we were talked about to try and ensure that smallholders and large businesses alike are complying. And so again, this helps to strengthen implementation, which in turn allows for strengthening of the standards in terms of sustainability, all leading to better market access. So it's a really, really good virtuous cycle. We recognize in particular that there is quite a big problem with smallholder uptake. And so that's why we have specific initiatives around capacity building. We work directly with smallholders in some instances, working with smallholders to comply with CIFOR-ICRAF, to comply with RSPO and ISPO, but also we work with larger firms to try and ensure that they can meet these requirements while still including smallholders within their supply chains. So trying to ensure that large firms can still take risk-based measures that incorporate smallholder activity. The final thing, I think this sort of ties everything together, is around international collaboration. And I think Valerie mentioned in her opening statement the FACT dialogue, Forest, Agriculture, Commodities Trade, which we co-chair with the government of Indonesia. So I think it's really important for us that we open up these kind of spaces that are not negotiating spaces, but are spaces for genuine dialogue. And we see with CIFOR-ICRAF and sustainable timber that this was not started in WTO space. It wasn't started with threats and negotiations, but it was started with groups of countries that wanted to change and make a difference, and there was an open space that enabled that. And so that's why we're putting a lot of energy into the FACT dialogue and into other related initiatives like the Amsterdam Declaration Partnership, and indeed the bilateral trade dialogue that we have with Indonesia, which is called the JETCO. Beatrice, in your request to me, you asked for like a couple things you thought would be really important opportunities. And actually, I think for me, it's recognition that these things take a long time and loads of people working together. And so I think, just to reiterate, like, it's great that we're all here. Thank you for coming.
And thank you very much, Alex. Thank you. And what we're hearing more and more now is the consideration of the inclusion of smallholders, the recognition that the challenges of all these market regulations are posing into them, but also the actions that are being taken to support them, from capacity building. And there was something really interesting that we heard at the beginning from Dr. Roberts, saying that there's a lot of pervasive incentives for the sector, and now we see a different approach of incentivizing other practices that can actually tackle some of the challenges that we see in the environmental, in the social and economic aspects. So this is a good example, and I think it's a good reflection to learn more about what the UK government is already envisioning and putting in place. And from the UK government and Europe, we're going to go to ASEAN, and we have Che de Jesus online. She, as I said, is a Sustainable Use and Access and Benefits Sharing Division Director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. And she has a wealth of knowledge and expertise and lessons to share with us today. So I invite you, Che de Jesus, I think you also have a presentation where you're going to share your experience, particularly on the ground, supporting livelihoods through biodiversity. Because this is not only about environment, this is also about people. So you will talk about that. And you will also share with us what challenges have you seen, what are the lessons learned, but also what are the best practices that can be escalated and amplified. So the floor is yours. Che, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, ladies. I hope you can hear me.
We hear you sound and clear.
Okay, thank you. My presentation made it through. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. I was given the task of making a presentation on what we are doing on the ground, and what are the challenges and some lessons learned on what we have been doing. So I will be making a presentation based on the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity's site level experiences in sustainable livelihood. Next slide, please. So I would just like to very briefly introduce our center. We are a regional organization under the ASEAN, and the center was established by 10 ASEAN member states in 2005, and we are mandated to facilitate cooperation among the ASEAN member states and with relevant national and international organizations on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in the region. Next slide, please. So these are just a brief look of the priority programs of our center. We work on biodiversity conservation, mainstreaming biodiversity, capacity development, knowledge management, communication, education, public awareness, and partnerships. Next slide, please. One of the flagship programs of the ASEAN is the ASEAN Heritage Parks program, which is the program manages a regional network of representative protected areas created to generate greater collaboration between the AMS in preserving their shared natural heritage. I'm putting this into context because the site level experiences that we are implementing, that we are doing, that I will be sharing with you in the next slides, are anchored and are being implemented at the ASEAN Heritage Parks, in selected ASEAN Heritage Parks, and in the surrounding communities or the buffer areas adjacent to the protected areas, to the ASEAN Heritage Parks. Next slide, please. I will focus on two projects or programs that we have implemented in support of livelihood at the site level. First is the biodiversity-based products as an economic source for the improvement of livelihood and biodiversity protection, or the BBP project, which was supported by GIZ, and the small grants program, which is supported by the by KFW. Next slide, please. So the biodiversity-based products project, or the BBP, was implemented between from 2015 to 2019 with the objective of the ACB supporting the ASEAN member states in the promotion of their biodiversity-based products for the improvement of livelihoods and biodiversity protection according to their needs. I will just share here some key outcomes. Out of this project, 7 BBP value chains were promoted, resulting in better income and conservation of biodiversity for the local communities. For instance, the implementation was in 3 ASEAN member states: Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Vietnam. For Cambodia, vine handicrafts and black ginger were sold and established business linkages with buyers in Siem Reap and in Phnom Penh. In Laos PDR, some products out of bamboo were awarded with the District 1 product certificate, and this project also resulted into reduced logging, poaching, and slash and burn. And it also provided regular income to the community surrounding the protected area. And in Vietnam, several products also came out, and the value chains of these were also established, such as the bukai. Bukai is a sort of vegetable that is found only in one of the ASEAN Heritage Parks. Production of medicinal bath herbs, honey, and jaculam. Jaculam is a kind of tea also found only in one of the ASEAN Heritage Parks. And so the value chains here provided premium income through sales and purchase contracts with the private sector, and then in-situ and ex-situ planting measures continued to support conservation of biodiversity. Next slide, please. The Small Grants Program with the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, as I said, was supported through a financial cooperation with KFW with the objective of strengthening biodiversity protection and management of natural resources in line with the basic needs of the local population in the ASEAN, by strengthening the role of ACB in its in promoting biodiversity protection, focusing on the national component, which is more of our site level support. It aimed to improve biodiversity protection and to improve the livelihood of local communities. We are working in the program, the SGP, is working in 3 AMS, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Indonesia, in selected ASEAN Heritage Parks. So in Myanmar, we are working in 4 ASEAN Heritage Parks. In Vietnam, there are also 4. And in Indonesia, 2 ASEAN Heritage Parks, namely Gunung Loiser National Park and Waikambas National Park. The projects in Indonesia officially ended December 2022. Next slide, please. Just some highlights out of the program includes, for instance, in Myanmar, currently ongoing, we are supporting mangrove restoration in one of the ASEAN Heritage Parks, and it is a cash for work intervention wherein the communities living around the protected area produce the mangrove seedlings that will be utilized in doing the rehabilitation of the area. At the same time, in one of the other ASEAN Heritage Parks, some grants are also provided for projects on sanitation improvement, sustainable agriculture, community ecotourism, community forestry, and sustainable fishery. In Indonesia, as I mentioned, we ended the project in December 2022. Out of the small grants program in Indonesia it produced 25 new products, and out of the 75 grant projects that were implemented, which also included 3,538 beneficiaries having been trained in various capacity development activities. In Vietnam, which is now currently ongoing, there are 10 microgrant projects wherein activities include composting, pig raising, ecotourism training, and awareness raising. And also 18 small grant projects in the buffer areas, the adjacent communities in the selected ASEAN heritage parks, under the thematic areas of conservation and livelihood, ecotourism, improvement of non-timber forest products, and support to farmers cooperatives. Next slide, please. I would just like to highlight some outcomes out of the Indonesia small grants program. These included enhancing the skills and capacity of women in targeted villages through series of alternative livelihood interventions such as bamboo handicraft, backyard home garden, bee farming, eco-printing development, and business entrepreneurship. And as I mentioned, new local products were developed and marketed, such as traditional health drinks, pineapple dodol, honey and honey value-added products, as well as upscaling of value-added products of banana chips. Highlighted there are just some of the outcomes coming out of the small grants projects in Indonesia. Next slide, please. One of the questions that Beatrice also posed for us in making this presentation is what were the challenges and opportunities coming out of those site level implementation. As you can see from the beginning of my presentation, the title of my presentation is Biodiversity Conservation and Livelihood: A Balance in Implementation. We consider this as a balance because we are looking at we are encouraging communities surrounding the protected areas to stop extracting resources from the protected areas as a form of their contribution to conservation, which in turn is also their contribution in the management of the protected area. Traditionally, protected area management is only within the government, which is government-led. But the projects at ACB, at site level, encourages collaborative management. But this proves to be both a challenge and an opportunity. Top-down approaches that have been practiced and that is traditionally being done and that is operationalized in protected areas will really take time to be reversed, or at least accommodate the participation and collaboration of all stakeholders. It also poses a range of possibilities in exploring new partnerships, new approaches, encouraging new stakeholders to be involved, balancing out the roles of each of the stakeholders in terms of managing in the management of the protected area, as well as encouraging local communities surrounding the protected areas to explore other means of livelihood besides extracting resources from the protected area. Another challenge, I think this is quite common, is the complex processes in government regulations, coordination, and feedback mechanisms, as well as even the whole mechanism of the small grants program. For instance, the grant administration can also be quite complex. So this was really quite a challenge in the implementation. the project duration is deemed short to fully realize and achieve results. For instance, under the small grants program, the small grants is only for a period of 12 to 14 months, while for micro grants it's only for 6 to 8 months. While there are a lot of outcomes and results coming out of the small grants, when we asked for feedback from the grantees and the beneficiaries, they really mentioned that the implementation period is quite short. And that's the challenge as well in terms of how is sustainability being factored after all of the implementation. Which leads me to the last challenge, which is establishing relationships for sustainability and future endeavors, including marketing, partnerships, institutionalization, and policy. This becomes a challenge, especially for local organizations, local communities who do not normally factor these in their operations or in their normal everyday activities. So if livelihood intervention actually becomes an opportunity, the other connected factors that would enable them to participate in a larger market becomes a challenge because they're not really used to engaging in this wider arena of marketing their products. Next slide, please. I think that would be my last slide. So what were the lessons that we have learned out of these experiences at site level? Local communities become interested in managing biodiversity resources once they understand and they perceive that there's a direct economic benefit. We have a saying in the Philippines that if it's near the gut, if experience is close to the gut or to the stomach, that's when it becomes more appreciated or it becomes more real for them. The recognition and appreciation of local communities, market and trade actors, and local authorities of the value of biodiversity-based products are heightened when they are made aware of how biodiversity conservation and management leads to economic benefits. So another lesson here is linking producers to private sector was a key factor in making value chain successful. So even while it's not really the normal thing for them to do, the projects, specifically the BBP project, factored in having to link those who are producing, the producers with the private sector, so that there's a clear the market, the value chain becomes appreciated and successful. Involving all relevant local government agencies helped to clarify rights and responsibilities of communities to manage biodiversity resources in a sustainable manner. There may be differences in terms of policies at the local level, at the district level, even at the provincial level. But just the same, if all local authorities would be involved and would be given the opportunity to really collaborate and interact and have a clear engagement with communities in terms of these projects or these site level implementations, it would clear the air in a way in terms of clarifications of what exactly are policies, what exactly are the responsibilities, and what are the avenues that the communities could actually tap into, so that in managing biodiversity resources, there's a more collaborative nature happening between them. Another lesson is facilitating learning and exchange processes help stakeholders overcome initial hurdles in production, processing, conservation, and institutional growth. So capacity building is always very important and valuable in any implementation. As a baseline, if there are really a lack in capacities in terms of as simple as managing finances, or organizing, or connecting with the right people when you do the marketing. It's always important to factor that in any of the project implementation, so that it it in the long run, even beyond the project life, stakeholders, beneficiaries would carry this on in terms of how they will continue with the project, even beyond funding, or even beyond the intervention of those organizations coming in. The second to the last lesson, anchoring the origins of a product with stories of its source, its environment, and the culture attached to it provides a strong identity, advocacy for conservation, and the marketing promotion that will not lead to exploitation of those resources. It is what we observed out of the products coming out of the communities, is they attach a strong story, and that's anchored on history, anchored on culture, and it provides a good it's a marketing promotion, but at the same time it carries an advocacy that is also linked to the conservation of the resource where that product originated from. So it's important to keep the stories, keep those exchanges in culture on how it was produced, because that's always a valuable element when the product is being marketed, but not to the extent of having it abused or having it exploited. Those are very important factors to be taken into consideration. Lastly, new and emerging market models are exciting, definitely. E-commerce, social media marketing, the live selling on social media, use of cyber currency or other currencies that may be used for trade and marketing. But these would need to be adaptable to realities at the local level. It is not an immediate solution, or it should not be given as a false promise for communities that once they learn these new market models, or they learn about these new technologies in terms of marketing their products, they would immediately have an increase in income. It's important to adapt it to the realities and how they are really doing it at their communities at site level, because in the long run they will be the one carrying it on, and it will not be dependent on any organization outside, and the support coming from the institutions surrounding them would be very valuable if they will also be very much involved in that reality. And terima kasih. Maraming salamat.
And thank you, Chair, for giving us a zoom in of what's happening in the countries in the ASEAN region, also for connecting us to the next speaker, that you actually mentioned the private sector plays a key role in all of this, in the implementation, in capacity building. We also see the opportunities for many countries to access finance, which is another important element. So now I invite you, Agus, he is a senior advisor of Goldin Agri Resources. He also has a presentation that will help us facilitate the discussion, and you have an important intervention to tell us what's the role of the private sector and what actions are being taken to move this agenda forward. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Beatrice. First of all, thank you to CIFOR, UNEP, and other organizers of this event for inviting me to share some of the results of the journey that we had in, to be short, in complying to EUDR. And the next slides, please. So the questions about actions, what do we do? First of all, in trade, you need to know who are you buying from and who you are selling to. And that means you need to know, as a producer of palm products, your suppliers. We need to know who that sells fruit bunches to us, where they are, how big is their plantations. And then we need to know how the fruits is traveling from one plantation to another plantations to the mills, and then the palm oils from the mills to the refineries. We need to develop the internal traceability system to be able to allocate the information from the plantation to the end products that we sell. Traceability systems such as blockchain can help in developing trust among the stakeholders. Pilot testing is definitely, and then lastly, we need to create value of this extra effort because those efforts are costly. Next slide. Now, what are the challenges? As has been mentioned before, in palm oil sector, there are more than 2.5 million smallholders that produce palm oil. And if we use the ISPO or RSPO certification as a proof of clean and clear products, unfortunately, there is only 1% of that 2.5 million individuals who has that certification. And simply because of that, the product of the small farmers will not be allowed to get into the supply chains to Europe. In other words, the UDR will create an effective ban to the product of the 2.5 million individual farmers because they cannot fulfill the requirement. Now, why is it so? Unlike timber, coffee, cacao, processing palm fruit bunches into food or other industrial goods involve complicated process. The fruit bunches change form from solid fruits into liquid, into gas, solid, and back and forth, both at the mills and at the refineries. They also travel long distances with trucks, with barges, with ships. So a sophisticated traceability system is needed if you really want to know where is the chocolate that you are eating coming from. What may be the shortcut is to require that the product must be segregated. It's simple. If everything is already kosher from the beginning, already halal from the very beginning, and keep it separated from the dubious product, then you get the kosher products at the end. But segregated is, first of all, technically maybe possible, but it is so expensive that it's not affordable. Next slide. Now I would like to focus on the later on the issue of traceability. But before that, I would like to answer your questions about the contribution. The company that I'm working for since 2017 has already collected the smallholder supply. So we have a total of 150,000 farmers, data farmers, including their plantations, that get into the supply chains of GAR. The numbers sounds big, but it is very small compared to the 2.5 million of smallholders in Indonesia. I doubt that there is any other company who has as much as 150,000 farmers' data. But we have gone through analyzing the internal traceability challenges, as I mentioned, the difficulty of liquid, solid, gas, back to liquid again. But we need to have that at every invoice that we issue, we can provide the information of where the fruit's coming from. Now, on the other part of our contributions, of the company's contributions, companies have been trying to help smallholders with the replanting programs and also with the capacity building to help the smallholders in getting the sustainability certification. There are also a number of other things that we have been doing, but let me focus on the real critical issue to address the issue of trade. Next slide. Now, this is just the illustrations. On ISPO, we only have 34 certificates. On RSPO, 117 scheme smallholders, and independent is only 17,000 independent smallholders of that 2.5 million. Next slide. This is the challenge, right? You may think that traceability is simple, from estate to mill to refinery to the buyers, and at every step there is a scale to find out how many kilograms, how many tons that you bring. Next slide. But you need to remember that the traceability involves two parts, the internal and the external. The internal including where the independent smallholders coming from, where the agent coming from. Also that where there are so many palm oil mills in Indonesia, more than 2,000 mills, who most of them are not certified. So all those products coming into the refineries, and all the products from the refineries goes to the buyers in Europe. Continue. Next slide, please. Just to give illustrations, one batch of a sales order that we issued to a buyer, actually in the refinery, it came from 9 batches. At the bulking area where we have storage tanks, it has 72 batches. And those 72 batches coming from 25 palm oil mills. Those 25 palm oil mills came from 90 estates. That's only one batch. So if we have thousands of batch, then the complications you can see. Mind you, that because of the process within the mills and the refineries, the original geolocation is commingled with so many other things, getting back and forth. So we need to have a system to enable a trustworthy traceability system. Next slide. These green dots shows the complications. Every green dot represents the commingle, the mix-up of various batches within a process. With these so many green dots in just one batch, then we need not only to learn exactly, because normally if you process one in one tank, for example, then you don't do it emptying the tanks and move to another one. At the most, you probably only send 80% or 90%. So the rest 10, 20% that has the same location will then be mixed with the others. And so it continues. So that shows the complications. Next slide. We talk about external. There are agents, sub-agents, sub-agents, before we go to the individual farmers. Now, this is where it's critical, and I'm thank you for Bapak Abednego Tarigan, who is willing to stay to listen to this, because this is where we have the biggest challenge. Next slide. In order to produce different types of products, we are delivering traceability to mills, which is already done, traceable to the plantations, partially done. 98% of the company that I'm working for, products are traceable to the plantations. We still have 2-3% that are not. Quality product on services, certain buyers requires very specific quality, and that cannot be done by the traceability system of mass balance or only the transaction, because the quality is commingled within the process. You need to have a different level, a more deeper traceability. For the NDPE score of food and safety, for example, also food and safety, the Chinese buyers are very particular with this characteristic. The existing traceability system cannot deliver that. We need to come up with molecular or batches tracing. The future EU regulations is a question mark, because the UDR is one thing, the NDPE can be solved, but only partial. Next slide. So there is no softwares that you can buy for the type 3. Type 1, yes, you have. There are consultants who can do that. Type 2, yes. But type 3, you don't have it. We need to develop it by ourselves. So hopefully we can come up with a system internally that can be tested and can be shared with the others by next year. Next slide. So what is it, the enablers to move forward? We need to move from 1% to at least 50% to enable the smallholders to get into the supply chain. Because that 1% is actually spread in many places. So it's even less than 1% in a particular mill that that they are close by. And if we want to bring them on board, we need to get 50%. And that 50% certainly can only be done if the public sector is involved. And we cannot just create a system where then the small farmers apply and submit forms. That is a waiting game, right? We need to be proactive. We need to have jemput bola, Pak Nego. We need to increase from 1% to 50%. And that can be done if there is a team assigned to go one district after another district and doing all the censusing so that the small farmers are registered. And being registered, they have legality and they have locations. But right now, this month, is only 15 months before the UD are going to be enacted. How are we going to do increasing from 1% to 50% if there is no special decree, special instruction to tell the Ministry of Agriculture, go and collect the data and put it in your system? Otherwise, they will not be able to get into the supply chain. A realistic roadmap is needed, even though with all the hard work, with all the intention, the political will of bringing on board the smallholders, we may not have enough time in 15 months. So we need to sit together with the EU, with the other respective buyers, and come up with a roadmap. We need time to deliver this. Malaysia only probably need 200, 300,000 farmers, more to do. And they are thinking to us for extension. We have 2.4 million farmers to collect. So just an example, anecdotal example. One of the NGO, IDH, has been able to bring 3,000 farmers in Aceh to be registered on the electronic STDB system. But they have to do it. They can do it after 3 years. 3,000 farmers for 3 years. So 500,000 farmers will require 500 years. Yeah, okay, how are you going to do that parallel? How many parallel IDH you can have? How many parallel WWF you can have? There is not enough. So let's focus on helping the smallholders to do that. And then we also need to be realistic with the no deforestation claim. You know that every shipment, every ship that we send to Europe, bring along 6 million data points. That's one shipment. Yeah. And if you are doing inspections of 1%, that means you have to look into what? 60,000 data points. How many days do you need to review 60,000 data points? So the system, as it said, it's not doable. It's huge administration burden. We need to come up with a smarter way so that we can say this ship is coming from deforestation-free area. You don't need to inspect 6 million data points. Just go. Now we need to sit there and negotiate. And next slide. So, and what I'm talking is only about traceability. There are issues of human rights, decent living wage, other social issues that the NGOs will continue bringing the issue. Issues of land grab, land tenure conflicts, unfair wages, all those things that we have heard. And there will be more and more about that. And until there is a clear legality, the rights of indigenous people, then those issues will keep popping up. And we just have to live with it. The no deforestation criteria, however, unfortunately, is already started by EU and will be adopted by markets in North America, in China, in India, in other advanced Asian countries. So we do need to tackle these unrealistic EUDR definitions on some before it got contagious effect to the other markets, before such regulations become really a huge utopian enigma. I thank you.
And thank you very much for bringing the importance point of data, of having data to help us make decisions, and specifically on the traceability systems, but also bringing up the need for the human rights and the social elements to be accounted, and the examples that Golden Agri Resources is already doing, facing, but also turning the challenges into opportunities. And we will have time for 1 or 2 questions. We just have one more speaker, and actually we have a special guest today with us, so we're gonna give the floor after the Q&A. So I will invite our last speaker, but obviously not the least important, who's joining us online, is Abu Meridian, the campaigns leader. He has also a short presentation that will help us just facilitate the discussion. And as I said, after his presentation, we're gonna have 1 to 2 questions. We're gonna take 1 online and 1 in person. So the floor is yours, Abu. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks Beatrice for the opportunity for give a CIFOR presentation. Yeah, before we going through to the presentation, we want to respond also about the EUDR, yeah. As your info, that Kaum believes that trade can be leveraged to support the local and national initiative. With regard to the forestry community, such as palm oil, since 2022, we have been working with the local organization and smallholder union in West Kalimantan and Jambi to develop a multi-stakeholder platform for sustainable palm oil, focusing on support smallholder to able to comply with the sustainable practice standard, and they are important stakeholder in the sector. Besides that, also Kaum coordinate coalition that's member around 44 CSO around Indonesia that we conduct policy advocacy, so that the demand set measure such as EUDR can be effective implemented without negative impact on smallholders, and it can be support policy reform in the country. So if you want more detail about the response from the NGO and then also the policy paper, you can going through to website CIFOR. Next slide, please. Next. Yeah, first we work to have the such practice such illegal logging, land grabbing, and unsustainable palm oil plantation. CIFOR conduct in-depth investigation to expose environment crime, carry out a high-profile campaign to raise awareness and advocate to policymakers for better regulation. Secondly, we also actively promote and support local sustainable initiative led by the indigenous people and local community, or IPLC. We firmly believe that the IPLC have the solution and must be at the forefront for managing their customary forest and land. We facilitate participatory mapping, set up a local cooperative, and also the alternative livelihood program. We believe that fighting and halting the injustice and harms to the environment and people often associate with a large-scale exploitative industry in the precondition needed to that a local lead community-based initiative can flourish. Next slide, please. Yeah, this our example activity on the grounds. We have an activity in Penasemos that we have conducted since 2003. That on 2003 we have approached by the leader Penasemos, informing that their village forests were being infested by the illegal logging. Then Kaum Tlapak and EIA that time exposed the commercial scale illegal logging in the area. Then follow up by the government with the Operasi Hutan Lestari 2, with our report, The Last Frontier in Papua, to stopping the legal activity in the Kenasa Mos area. So we work, after that, we work the community to map their area in order to secure and newspaper territory. This initiative was joined by the NGO that continue to work with the community. Then on 2014, the Ministry of Forestry issued the village forest in Mangroholo in Sira, just around 3,000 hectare. There's only 5% from the total national people area is around 81,000 hectare. But yeah, this start on the ground. Then the people customers have been managed their forest and produce forest product such as sagu, sold in the Penabuan. It's like Tenmiron is capital in the south of the regency. Then right now, starting October, Kaum Tlapak back work in the Kenasai Mos to protect the remaining forest and the further export to develop the development initiative. Yeah, this some picture. Next slide, please. Yeah, this some picture from the ground. Next. Next. Then for the Klabili, this is also in Tambrau. This is using the ecotourism. So we not only using the product from the community, but also how to bring the opportunity for the activity like a bird watching in the ground also. Then the next slide, please. There's some picture from the ground. Next. Yeah, then this example from the Kesempatan Karang in Banten, in Java, ya. So recognizing the personal robusta coffee in the Kesempatan Karang, because yeah, this planted since the colonial era. So through the program CFA, we work with local community. We work with through coffee roastery with the workout and also with the community. Then Kesemun Karang is like the first Kesemun forest recognized by the Ministry of Forestry in 2016. Kaum Tlapak also support the community like these people to enhance the coffee management and quality in the area. Then yeah, currently the coffee still thriving well. The forest is still well managed. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is some picture. We're also going to the Guatemala on 2017 or 18, yeah, to learning about how the development forest in Guatemala. Then we also bring also the community in the sub-area in Java to learning about how to manage the coffee plantation. Next. Yeah, for the key action or enabler. The key action enabler to identify and use suitable forestry and agri system, we think there is two very important about the land security, because we need to ensure the access in the land to the resource, and also the conflict resolution also is very important to resolve for the community. Then the facilitation support to smallholder, farmer and local news people, community, this also is very important. But we need also to look the local hero or the local community that have like support the activity on the ground, because they can influence another community to doing the activity in the ground. So the main role Kaum Tlapak and also other CSO, we can advocate the for policy and regulation that protect indigenous people, land right, and promote the student practice, provide technical assistance to farmer and community, including the empowering women and youth, market access, and the CSO can also help on farmer and forest community access and promote their product to sustainable conscious market. Then foster partnership and collaborative among the various stakeholders, including the government agency, CSO, private sector, and also the community. So from our learning in the ground, yeah, from Komplapa, yeah, we thinking it's very important to support the local community because they have like local knowledge how to maintain the area. So from that, with the what happened in the ground, so we can also to support the campaign with the community. I think that's from us, Brits. Thank you.
Agriculture, with communities, with indigenous people, and now I see you're also engaging with Guatemala and bringing other exchanges, and I hear continuously this capacity building, this access to finance. We're going to be closing now the panel. There's definitely a lot of questions that we're receiving online and in person, and I will invite my colleague Sonia to help us take one question from the room. And also, there are some questions online that I would also ask to be read from the microphone. So I will start with a question in the room. Please raise your hand. I see one hand there. Thank you. I will invite you to introduce yourself, and if there's a question for a specific panelist, to direct it.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joy. I am from IPB University. I'm a forestry student, so this panel is very interesting for me as well. And especially I want to ask for Madam Corazon from ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. So it's very interesting how you discuss about biodiversity conservation and stuff. Like, we are so rich in that. Asian, Southeast Asian, and other European countries, very rich of that. But I think we are facing the same problems and issue every year, day by day. And like, actually my question is how to build the commitment, like the same level commitment between every stakeholders. Because I think everybody knows how every state's like have money oriented, like, so that's always a main problem. It never achieved the local community, even though some local community also have money oriented issues and problem. So from the biodiversity perspectives, as a biodiversity people who concern biodiversity, how you suggest to build the same level of commitment to achieve the sustainable biodiversity conservation effort and to for our future. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks for
so
your
much for
question.
that. Yeah, should I answer now or?
Yes, please go ahead. And I will also potentially invite our panelists to give us one key response for these questions. I think we could have different perspectives as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it's really a challenge to get that kind of commitment. But it's always it's a work in progress. We start, of course, with the efforts that we are doing on the ground. That's already getting the commitment at that level for them, for all of the stakeholders to get involved. It's ensuring that each has a role and each has an important responsibility to play in the conservation of biodiversity. As I mentioned in the presentation, when people see the importance related to their reality, that's when you get the kind of commitment for them to really for them to commit, for them to realize that, okay, this is affecting me and it's affecting others that may be surrounding me and the future generation. So it's really a matter of making it close to the gut, making it more realistic, and ensuring that everyone it's really tough. It would not be an overnight achievement, but we start slow. We start simply on the ground, and at the same time, the ACB, for instance, is also working at the regional level, where we are engaging with a lot of the governments, the other sectors, and putting it out there that business as usual is no longer possible. We need to step up. We need to really engage each other. It's not just within our own territory anymore. We have to engage more closely with other sectors, with other stakeholders beyond our normal circle of the sector. For instance, if it's just conservation, if you talk to other conservation, it's always just the same thing. You have to make sure to reach out to other sectors. It's mainstreaming your advocacy on conservation to other sectors so that they will be more involved and there will be more commitment. It's doing things at the site level, at the national level, and also at the regional level. I hope that answers your question. It's a tough job, but
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'll invite to each of you to give us one last reflection, maybe linked to the same question, different perspectives. Would you like to start, Alex?
Sure. So I think when we're thinking a lot about incentives, I touched a bit on this in my presentation. There are positive and negative incentives kind of for everything, and where incentives align, you get action. So for example, right now we have a project on ecological fiscal transfers. It's a way of like flowing money through fiscal systems to reward great ecological outcomes. And it's systems like that, both positive and negative, support, but also fines, demands, but also support, that coming from all angles. Private sector partners demanding that their upstream partners comply, but also supporting them. Or really important interventions from civil society, all the great stuff that Kamtalapak is doing on ensuring enforcement, creating those incentives for action. So that's my contribution.
Thank you, Henriette.
Thank you very much. Everything that the two previous speakers said, and strongly embedded in regulation and enforced.
On the questions of how the biodiversity conservation can be delivered, I think there are two possibilities. One is the charity support, and the other one is when it's parts of your main business. And to be part of the main business has a much more successful results, but that requires regulations. For example, if you are a palm oil operator who would like to get certification from RSPO or ISPO, then you need to set aside the area with high biodiversity value, called high conservation value, and the one that has many trees, called the high carbon stock. The company that I'm working for has 80,000 hectares of both HCV and HCS, and that is a bigger size than Singapore. And that will stay because it's the only way that we could sell our products with the certifications, which hopefully we will get the premium price that will be able to cover the costs of maintaining those conservation area.
Thank you very much to three of you. As you can imagine, our online chat is flooded with a lot of questions about the EUDR, and we will respond to them online. As I said, we have a special guest today, so I'm gonna close the session thanking first of all to the three panelists today in person, the two panelists joining us online. Please give us a round of applause. And just to say that it's very difficult to summarize everything that has been shared already because there's a lot of knowledge exchanges, but I think if we can pick on very consistent things that we have heard today from all of them is collaboration, access to finance, capacity building, support to smallholders and communities, and also to have in place the policies that will help facilitate this trade of sustainable agricultural commodities. With that, I thank you for your attention, for your engagement. Thank you to all the online participants for your patience and for being engaged. We're going to be sharing some of the resources shared by our speakers today, and you will have more information about the EUDR as well. And now I hand over to Dia for the last part of the session. Thank you.